My daughter was 3 years old when my mother told me she couldn't come. Not that she was busy, not that she was scared. She told me she couldn't come because Denny's rehearsal dinner was that same weekend and she had already paid for the centerpieces. Centerpieces. Lily had a mass behind her left eye the size of a walnut, and my mother had already paid for the centerpieces. Welcome back to Ravage Stories, where secrets come out, betrayals get exposed, and the people who thought they'd get away with it never do. If you're new here, subscribe, join the family. You're going to want to be here for what comes next. Drop a comment where you are listening from. It means a lot to me. Now let's go. My name is Claire Morrow, and I grew up in a place called Harlan County, Kentucky, which tells you most of what you need to know before I say another word. Not the romanticized version people write about from apartments in Nashville, the actual version, the one with the propane heat that cut out in January, the school lunches charged to a tab my mother paid in September with whatever was left after the electric bill, the calloused hands my father never apologized for because they were the reason we ate. I wore one good sweater to school for 3 years and I washed it on Sundays so it would be dry by Monday morning. I knew how to make a pound of dried beans last a week. I knew which neighbors would look the other direction and which ones would mention it to someone who would mention it to someone else. I knew the particular texture of dignity that working people carry, the kind that isn't loud, that doesn't announce itself, that just keeps going. I was the first person in my family to finish a 4-year degree, political science at Eastern Kentucky, which is not a prestigious institution, and I am not going to pretend it was. I drove 40 minutes each way for 2 years because I couldn't afford the dorms. I wore my mother's navy blue blouse to my graduation because I didn't own anything that felt like the occasion. My father drove 3 hours in a truck that needed a new alternator and parked it on a hill so it would start on the way home. He stood in the bleachers in his church clothes, and he didn't say much because he never did, but he kept his hand on my shoulder the entire way back to the truck, and that was enough. My father died the year I turned 31. Heart attack, fast, at home, the way he would have wanted. He left behind a small house on 4 acres outside of Harlan, a 2003 Ford pickup, a checking account with $11,000 in it, and 3 children. Me, my brother Dennis, who we called Denny, who was 26 at the time and working a landscape job in Lexington and spending more than he was making, and my younger sister Patrice, who was 23 and living at home and helping my mother, which I want to be clear about because Patrice matters in this story and she matters in my life, and the only reason I mention her at all here is so you don't forget about her. I had been married for 2 years when my father died. My husband, Marcus Morrow, grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a family that had more than we did, not wealthy, but stable in a way I had to learn to trust because I had never lived inside that feeling before. His parents, Jean and Patricia Morrow, had a hardware store they had run for 30 years. They were the kind of people who sat at a kitchen table with coffee and talked about real things. And the first time I was in that kitchen, I didn't know what to do with my hands because it felt like something I had watched on television. I loved them before I fully understood I was allowed to. Marcus and I were living in Knoxville when Lily was born. She was perfect in the specific, particular way that a first child is perfect, which means I was completely undone by her in the best possible direction. She had Marcus's brown eyes and my stubbornness and a laugh that started in her whole body. She was talking in full sentences by 2. She could identify 12 different birds by their calls. She was, by the most reliable measure I have, the best thing I have ever done. She was 3 years and 4 months old when the pediatric ophthalmologist in Knoxville referred us to Vanderbilt Children's Hospital in Nashville. The mass was behind her left eye. It was pressing. They needed to determine what it was, and they needed to do it quickly. And the word they kept using was quickly. And every time they said it, the floor shifted slightly under my feet. I called my mother from the hospital parking garage. It was a Tuesday in October. I had been sitting in the car for 20 minutes because I couldn't make my voice work right, and I didn't want Lily to see me cry. When my mother picked up, I told her what the doctor said, every word, including the word they kept using. I told her I needed her. I told her it would be at least 2 weeks of appointments, possibly a surgical consult, possibly longer if the biopsy required follow-up. I told her I was scared in a way that I hadn't been scared since I was a child, and she was the person I needed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she wished she could. She really did. But Denny's rehearsal dinner was that same weekend, and she had already paid the deposit on the centerpieces, and the wedding was the following Saturday, and she just couldn't leave him with all of that to manage alone. I want you to stay with that for a moment, because I have had 9 years to sit with it, and I still need a full breath before I can continue. Denny was getting married to a woman named Brianna, who was 31 and worked in mortgage sales and had opinions about table linens that she shared at considerable length. The wedding was at a venue outside of Lexington that ran $1,200 for the room rental alone. My mother had helped pay for the venue. She had paid for the rehearsal dinner. She had paid for Denny's suit, which was custom, which I know because Brianna mentioned it to me in the spring when I told her Lily's checkups were running long and expensive and I wasn't sure we could make the drive to Lexington for the engagement party. Brianna mentioned the suit cost $800. I didn't say anything. I was standing in the Vanderbilt parking garage at the time, between appointments, eating a granola bar for lunch because the cafeteria was expensive and we were watching every dollar. My mother did not come to Nashville. She went to the rehearsal dinner. She went to the wedding. She posted photographs on Facebook of herself at the reception in a mother-of-the-groom dress that, based on the fabric and the cut, I know cost more than our monthly car payment. In one of the photographs, she is laughing at something Denny is saying. She looks happy. She looks completely fine. Marcus's parents drove from Knoxville the morning after my first call. Jean and Patricia arrived with a casserole, a bag of groceries, a list of questions for the oncology team that Jean had written out on a legal pad, and the uncomplicated certainty that they were staying as long as we needed them. Patricia sat with Lily during the long wait times and read to her from a collection of picture books she had stopped at a store to buy on the way. Jean sat with Marcus and talked about things that were not Lily, so that Marcus had somewhere to put his eyes when the ceiling got too close. They were there for 11 days. They covered 3 days of meals, 2 tanks of gas, and 1 parking bill that Marcus tried to pay and Jean quietly took out of his hands. They did not mention money once in any direction. They did not post photographs. Lily's mass was a benign orbital dermoid cyst. The surgical team removed it in a procedure that took 4 hours and felt like 4 years. She came out of anesthesia asking for orange juice and wanting to know if the birds outside the window were house finches. The surgeon said the margin was clean. Jean cried in the hallway. Patricia held my hand so hard she left a mark on my palm, and neither of us mentioned it. My mother called 3 days after the wedding to ask how Lily was doing. The wedding was, according to her report, beautiful. Denny did not call at all. I want to be precise about the timeline because precision matters here. The surgery was October 22nd. Denny called for the first time on November 14th, 23 days later, and the reason he called was to ask whether I had anything of Dad's that I wanted to keep, because he and our mother were thinking of going through the house before winter. I asked whether they had told Patrice. He said Patrice knew about it. I called Patrice 20 minutes later. Patrice had not been told about it. This is how the next 7 years began. Not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a screaming match in a driveway, with a phone call about a dead man's house and a lie told so casually it didn't even have the decency to be nervous. My mother and Denny went through my father's house. They took the truck. They took the furniture that had value. They sold the riding mower and a collection of hand tools that my father had accumulated over 40 years of working with his hands. Tools that were not antiques or collectibles, but were the specific instruments of a specific life, and they sold them at an estate sale without calling me or Patrice first. My father's checking account, the $11,000, moved into my mother's account within 30 days of his death, which was legal because she was the joint account holder, but it was done without discussion and without acknowledgement and without any of the conversation my father's money deserved. Patrice got his watch. I got the photograph from his graduation. His, not mine. A black and white photograph of a man in a gown holding a diploma, serious-faced and proud. I put it on the shelf in Lily's room because it was the best thing I had to give her from him, and because she should know what his face looked like when he accomplished something he earned. Marcus and I had a hard 2 years after Lily's surgery. Not in our marriage, that part held, but financially. The medical bills were managed, but they required management, meaning months of calls with insurance, an appeal that Marcus handled himself by reading every clause in our policy 3 times, a flexible payment arrangement with Vanderbilt that we honored every single month without exception. We were not destitute. We were, in the specific language of people who have been there, stretching. Every purchase considered, every luxury a question. We ate well enough. We paid every bill. But there was no cushion, and cushion is the difference between stress and fear, and we lived for a while in the space between them. My mother did not ask how we were doing financially. Denny did not ask. Neither of them offered anything. What they did, consistently, was call at holidays and update me on Denny's life. The new car, the house in a subdivision outside of Lexington with a 3-car garage, the boat he bought in the spring, the vacation to Cancun in February. Brianna had strong feelings about their kitchen renovation. The backsplash situation was apparently very involved. I listened to all of this. I made the appropriate sounds. I held the phone with one hand and held my coffee with the other, and I let it flow over me like water over stone, and I did not say a single word about the rehearsal dinner or the centerpieces or the $11,000 or the hand tools my father spent 40 years accumulating and that I would have given anything to keep one of. I was 37 when things began to change in the direction of better. I had been working as an office manager at a regional property management firm in Knoxville for 6 years at that point. I understood systems. I understood contracts. I understood the difference between what a document said and what it meant, and I had developed, through pure necessity, a detailed working knowledge of property law, tenant rights, and the regulatory framework that governed our work. My supervisor left in the fall for a position in Atlanta, and I was given his responsibilities without his title for 4 months while the company figured out what to do. At the end of those 4 months, I had a meeting with the regional director, a woman named Sandra Cho, who wore no-nonsense glasses and had a photograph of her mother on her desk. And Sandra told me flat that I had outperformed every metric they had, and she wanted to make the role permanent with the salary that went with it. The salary was $62,000 a year, which to someone who grew up making beans last a week felt like a number from a different language, except it wasn't, because I had earned it with my own hands and my own hours, and a 4-month stretch of 25-hour weeks that Lily noticed because she started leaving small drawings on my desk to keep me company. Marcus had been promoted the year prior. We paid off the medical debt. We put money into savings with a consistency that felt like something I was afraid to name out loud. Jean and Patricia were aging well. Jean's hip was slowing him down, Patricia's eyesight required more careful management, and Marcus and I had the conversation that every adult child of decent parents eventually has about the practical and financial shape of the years ahead. We had that conversation with real numbers. We had it without fear. My mother called in the spring of my 39th year. Denny was on the call too, which I knew within the first sentence because it had the particular quality of a conversation that has been rehearsed. She said things had gotten difficult. She meant financially. Denny's landscaping business, which had expanded and hired and over-leveraged, had contracted badly the previous year. He had taken out a second mortgage on the house in Lexington to cover payroll, and it had not fully resolved the problem. Brianna was still working, but the income gap was significant. My mother's fixed income wasn't covering what she needed in addition to what she was already helping them with. She said she knew things had been hard for Marcus and me too, but she was hoping we might be able to help. Even a little, even something. I was standing in the kitchen. Lily was in the next room doing homework. Marcus was at the hardware store with Jean, picking out shelf brackets for the garage reorganization project Jean had decided was urgent. I went to the hallway closet and I took out a folder. That folder had been living in this house for 6 years. I had started it the week after my mother called to say she couldn't come to Nashville because of the centerpieces. I had put in it every piece of documentation I could gather or reconstruct. Bank records my father's estate attorney had provided, the estate sale receipts I had requested, the photographs Patrice had taken of the house before my mother and Denny arrived to clear it, a printed copy of the Facebook photos from Denny's wedding weekend, time-stamped, the custom suit receipt, which Brianna had forwarded to me for a group expense spreadsheet she was keeping for the wedding party and had not thought to exclude from my copy, my own medical bills, organized chronologically, my own bank statements from the 2 years following Lily's surgery, printed and annotated, a written account of every phone call I could document, with dates and a short summary of the content, which I had been keeping in a notes document on my phone since the November call about my father's house. I had not been planning revenge. I want to be very clear about that. I had been protecting myself the only way I knew how, which was to keep a record, because I am my father's daughter, and my father believed in writing things down. I sat at the kitchen table with that folder open in front of me. My mother was still talking. She was explaining the situation more fully now, the specific numbers, the specific gaps. She mentioned that the house in Lexington might need to go back to the bank if something didn't change. She mentioned that Denny was really trying. I let her finish. Then I said the following, and I want to be accurate because I have replayed it enough times that I know it well. I told her I heard what she was saying. I told her I was going to be honest with her because I thought she deserved that. I told her that in October of the year Lily was 3, she chose a rehearsal dinner over her granddaughter's surgery, and that I had not forgotten that and did not plan to. I told her that in the months following my father's death, she and Denny had liquidated assets from his estate without consulting me or Patrice, and that I had documentation of what was sold and what it was worth. I told her that in the 2 years following Lily's surgery, while Marcus and I managed $40,000 in medical debt on our own income, She had contributed materially to Denny's wedding, his business, and his household, and that I also had documentation of that. I told her that Marcus and I had built something stable through our own work and through the generosity of people who showed up when we needed them, meaning Jean and Patricia, and that we had obligations to those people that came first. I told her I was not able to help. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, and this is the part that told me everything I needed to know about the full shape of the situation. She said she didn't know I had been keeping track like that. I said, I know. Denny got on the call then. His voice had a particular tone I recognized from childhood, the tone he used when he was about to be angry in a way he wanted to dress up as reasonable. He said I was being cold. He said family was family. He said he would have done the same for me. I let that sit for one full breath. Then I said the name of the weekend Lily was in surgery, the dates, and asked him what he had been doing on those dates. He said that wasn't fair. I said I agreed. It wasn't. I closed the folder. Patrice found out about the call 2 days later because my mother told her, which was actually something I had expected. My mother's version of events, as Patrice relayed it to me, described me as having gone through some kind of change, become someone harder and colder than I used to be. Patrice listened to my mother's version carefully, and then she called me. She asked me if I had the folder with me. I told her I did. She asked me if she was in it. I told her she was, specifically in the section about the estate, because I had used the photograph she took of the house, and I had noted in writing that she had not been informed in advance about the estate sale. Patrice was quiet for a moment. She was 36 at that time, living in Harlan still, working at the county health office, raising her daughter mostly alone after a marriage that ended quietly and without drama in the way that exhausted marriages sometimes do. She had been present for all of it, for every year of what I have just described, and she had watched it from closer range than I had. She said, and I want to get this right because she said it simply and she meant it simply. She said, I was always waiting for you to say something first. That was the conversation that mattered, not the one with my mother, not the one where Denny told me I was being cold, the one with Patrice, where we said true things to each other in plain language, and neither of us made it bigger than it was. We talked for 2 hours. I walked her through the folder. She had her own records, not a formal folder, but a memory she kept carefully, dates and amounts and words said, the way people who grew up without much keep accounts of everything that costs them. We put her memory and my documentation together, and we looked at the full shape of what had happened over the preceding 7 years, and when we laid it all out flat, it was almost geometrically perfect in its consistency. Every decision, every allocation, every choice about who got help and who was left to figure it out, it all pointed in one direction with a clarity that was almost restful to look at once you stopped flinching. We did not report anything to anyone. I want to be clear about that because I don't want to oversell what we did or dress it up in more dramatic clothes than it deserves. What we did was simpler and in some ways harder. We decided what we were and weren't going to do, and we agreed on it together, and we held to it. We were not going to provide financial support. We were not going to be available for calls that functioned as fundraising appeals wearing the costume of family conversation. We were not going to explain ourselves repeatedly. We had each explained ourselves once, clearly and completely, and that was the explanation. What we were going to do was stay in each other's lives with full honesty and full presence and make sure that Lily and Patrice's daughter, whose name is Rosie and who was 8 at the time and possessed of a remarkable ability to construct convincing arguments for why she should be allowed to stay up later, grew up knowing each other. Jean and Patricia came for Thanksgiving that year. Marcus made his mother's cornbread recipe and got it almost right, and Jean told him it was perfect, which was not entirely accurate but was entirely kind. Lily was 9 by then and had recently become interested in astronomy and spent a significant portion of the evening explaining the orbital mechanics of Jupiter's moons to Jean, who listened with complete attention and asked 3 follow-up questions that were genuinely good. Patricia and I did the dishes together, and she told me about a conversation she'd had with her own sister 30 years earlier that she had never fully described to anyone, and I understood without her saying it directly that she was telling me because she recognized something. She dried her hands on the dish towel, and she held my face in both her hands for a moment, the way mothers do, and she didn't say anything, and that was the right choice. Denny's house in Lexington went back to the bank in the spring. I know this because Patrice told me, not because anyone in my immediate family had the honesty to say it directly. The landscaping business restructured, which is the word people use when something contracts to survive. Brianna and Denny were still together, which I give them credit for because hard years test things, and apparently theirs held. In the summer following the bank situation, Denny called me again. He was calmer this time. The rehearsed quality was gone. He sounded like someone who had been living for a while inside the consequences of their choices and had arrived at a kind of exhausted honesty. He asked if we could talk, just the two of us, not with a specific ask attached. I told him I was willing to talk. He said, and this is the detail I turn over the most when I think about that call. He said he had thought about the timeline I gave him on the phone, those specific dates, and that he had looked them up, meaning he had gone back and checked what he had been doing that weekend, as if he needed confirmation that it had been real. He said he didn't know what to do with that. I told him I didn't need him to do anything with it. I told him I just needed him to know it, which he now did. He asked about Lily. I told him she was well, that the eye had been clean at every follow-up for 6 years, that she was in 4th grade and had recently decided she wanted to be either an astrophysicist or a veterinarian and was keeping her options open. He laughed a little at that. It was a real laugh. I don't want to tell you that conversation fixed everything. It didn't. It changed the temperature of something that had been very cold for a long time, and that is not nothing, but it is also not the same as repair, and I think dishonestly claiming repair would undermine the thing I'm trying to tell you. My mother and I talk on the phone twice a month. She does not bring up money. She does not bring up the folder, which she knows exists and which I have never threatened her with, because a threat was never the point. We talk about Lily. We talk about Patrice and Rosie. We talk about her garden, which she has expanded in recent years and which is producing, according to her reports, a genuinely unreasonable quantity of tomatoes. She sounds different than she used to, quieter, as if she's been listening to something I can't hear. I am 40 years old now. Lily is 12 and is currently devoted to the study of bird migration patterns, which means we spend a meaningful amount of time standing very still in fields. Marcus just made regional director at his company, which means I have watched Jean try to act casual about it and fail completely, which is one of my favorite things that has ever happened. Patrice is the lead administrator at the county health office now, which I mention not as a footnote, but as a fact that belongs in the center of this story, because Patrice quietly built something too, and she did it with the same materials I did: hard work and accurate record keeping, and the absolute refusal to believe that where you started determines where you end. The folder is still in the hallway closet. I have not thrown it away, and I don't think I will, not because I need it for any practical purpose anymore, but because it is a record of a real thing that happened, and real things that happened deserve to be kept. My father believed in writing things down. The folder is what I have of that from him. I want to say something carefully here, and I want you to hear it the right way. What I did was not revenge. Revenge requires that you do something to someone, and I didn't do anything to anyone. I declined to do something for them. I held a record of accurate facts, and I referenced those facts once, clearly, to the people who needed to hear them. I drew a boundary around what Marcus and I had built, and I held it without apology. That is not revenge. That is just self-possession, and self-possession is something that working people have sometimes been trained to believe they don't deserve. The first thing I want you to take from this is that documentation is not bitterness. Keeping a record is not the same as nursing a grudge. A folder of receipts and phone summaries is not a hate document. It is evidence of your own reality, and your reality deserves to be recorded, especially when the people around you are counting on you to forget. The second thing is that the people who show up are the family. I mean that with every piece of me. Jean and Patricia Morrow drove from Knoxville to Nashville with a casserole and a legal pad of questions, and they stayed 11 days, and they have never once held it over my head or referred to it when it would benefit them, and that is the specific definition of what family means, and I will not apply that word elsewhere just because elsewhere shares my last name. The third thing is that the boundary is the thing, not the speech, not the confrontation, not the big dramatic moment. The conversation with my mother was maybe 9 minutes long. The one with Denny was 6. What mattered was not those conversations. It was every conversation after them, in which I held to what I said without wavering, without re-explaining, without letting the emotional pressure of a phone call reshape a decision I had made when I was thinking clearly. The boundary is only as real as your willingness to maintain it when maintaining it is uncomfortable, and it will be uncomfortable, and you have to be willing to be the cold one, the changed one, the one who is apparently so different now, and stay in the decision anyway. The fourth thing is the one I didn't understand until recently, and it is this. Letting someone experience the consequences of their choices is not cruelty. I did not cause my brother's financial collapse. I did not cause my mother's difficult years. I declined to prevent them from experiencing what they had built, and those are different things, and the difference is important. I think sometimes we are so trained, especially women, and especially women from backgrounds where holding things together is survival, to absorb the results of other people's decisions, that we confuse absorption with kindness. It is not always kindness. Sometimes it is just the continuation of a pattern that has been costing you for years. There is one more thing I want to tell you before I go, and it is about Lily. She was 12 last month. For her birthday, she asked for a field guide to North American raptors, which is currently annotated in 3 colors of pen and lives on her nightstand. I drove her to a wetlands preserve outside of Knoxville on a Saturday morning, the 2 of us, before Marcus or Jean or anyone else was awake. We stood very still for a long time at the edge of a field, and she had the binoculars, and I had the coffee, and she spotted a short-eared owl crossing low above the grass, and she grabbed my arm without looking at me and said it, barely above a whisper. She looked at me sideways after it passed, and she said she thought owls were mostly nocturnal. I told her most of them were, not all. She thought about that for a moment, and then she said, that was interesting, the exceptions. I kept looking at the field. I thought about my father's hand on my shoulder, walking back to the truck that needed a hill start. I thought about Jean's legal pad with the questions written out. I thought about Patrice saying, I was always waiting for you to say something first. I thought about a folder in a hallway closet that I will never need to open again and that I am not throwing away. I thought about a little girl who asked for orange juice coming out of anesthesia and wanted to know about the birds outside the window. Yeah, I told Lily, the exceptions are interesting. Here is my question for you today, and I am asking it because I mean it, not because it makes a good closing line. If you had that folder, if you had kept that record, if you had done the quiet work of writing it all down, would you have opened it in that moment, or would you have stayed silent one more time to keep the peace? Think about it honestly. Think about what the silence has cost you over the years. Think about what your version of the folder contains and whether it deserves to be acknowledged. I think you know the answer. I think that's why you're still here. If this story hit you somewhere real, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the person who needs to hear it. I'll see you soon.